There we go. All right, go.
All set? All right, everybody. Thank you again for joining today. Got an exciting presentation for you today. So introducing myself, I'm David Ciroli. I'm the CEO and founder of ePS and NDVSB program. Today, our guest speaker, keynote speaker is Mr. Michael Hogan, Air Force Pentagon Purchasing. So I'm going to start off very high level. A lot of you that are on the call today probably have been some of my other webinars, but we do have quite a few people that are joining today that haven't been on my other webinars or on my briefs. So I want to just give a very high level of EPS and the NDVSB program and our partners. So again, we have a lot of different businesses on the phone today and listening in. Our main partners that we work with at NDVSB, and NDVSB stands for National Diversity Veteran and Small Business Program. That's our program here at EPS. So it's become the largest diversity and veteran and small business inclusion program in the country. So we're very proud to be able to say that. Some of the partners that specifically with NDVSB and our federal program and with the Air Force here is AAFES, the exchange stores on all of the bases. AAFES is also one of our customers and uses our eMarketplace technology on all the bases throughout the world. Rosie Network for the veterans. I've been working with the Rosie Network for several years now. NMSDC, the National Minority Supplier Development Council. A lot of the businesses from there are on here as well. And we have other partners as well, SBA and the VBOC. So I'm sure we have some of the businesses on from there. NBBDC, Keith King Certification Group, works with the $1 Billion Roundtable, and Veteran, VETRM. That's another one that we're working with. So we have a lot of support with the NDVSB program. Under our program, we have private and public sector opportunities. So we have two different programs that fall under that. And coming in, and in 2022, around Q2, we're also going to have B2C e-marketplaces under NDVSB, and that's going to be with Rosie and with AAFES. So a lot of opportunities coming through the NDVSB program. We also work with hundreds of corporations, mostly Fortune 1000, Fortune 500 throughout the country. And we do that with NMSDC. So that's another program, again, that falls underneath there, working in the private sector with our corporations. But today, specifically, we're going to be talking about the Air Force First Look program. And I just want to touch, again, just shortly touch base on our approach, our rollout. Some of you on the call might be involved in some of the other federal e-marketplaces. So I just want to give you a little brief on that, on our approach, completely different than the other federal e-marketplaces. And I truly believe that's one of the reasons why we have so much momentum right now. So Julie, if you can go to that next screen for me real quick. So our approach with our NDVSB and AAFES e-marketplace with all the Army and Air Force bases, and again, we're going to be speaking specifically on Air Force today, but our approach is to align our small business partners, which each one of the bases throughout the country, in multiple product categories and in services. So we're the only federal e-marketplace out there that offers service suppliers within our program. And that's one of the areas that the Army and Air Force will be looking closely at as well. But it's a very different approach than other e-marketplaces. Our e-marketplace also has e-procurement functionality, completely different than any other one that's out there. Won't get into that detail. As a matter of fact, I'm going to have a webinar, and we'll invite all of you again on the 20th, and we're going to talk in more detail about NDVSB and the programs underneath that. So you'll see an invite for the 20th for that webinar as well. But back to the approach. So each one of the bases, they're going to have their own private instance of the NDVSB AAFES Marketplace. Everything goes through the AAFES commerce site to connect to the NDVSB Marketplace and connect to our small business partners. So that's really a big change, a big difference, a big differentiation point that we have compared to other e-marketplaces. So making it very easy for the GPC holders, the card holders on the bases to be able to find their small businesses and spend money with those small businesses. So each one literally will own their own e-marketplace, and they're going to build it specific to their needs and requirements, and they're going to build it around the small businesses that they're looking for in both product and categories. So a completely different approach. Granted, it does take a little bit longer to do that, and we call it a marathon. It's not a sprint, because we are doing that alignment. Our goal is to be able to, and Mike will go through this, is diffuse the spend that's on the Gov't Pcard with the Air Force and the Army, and diffuse that spend to the small businesses. So in order to get a high adoption rate, you really have to spend time up front and do a lot of heavy lifting. I'm going to talk more about that on the 20th, about what we're doing up front, the heavy lifting, how we're doing the alignment, and so on. Next screen, please. So with the Air Force First Look program, and we are going to be passing out the PowerPoint today, and you'll also get the recording of this. But these are the first 30 bases that we discussed with Mike and which ones we're focused on to start the alignment. You'll get this first. That doesn't mean the other bases are left out. Those remaining bases are going to follow immediately. Our goal is to get all the alignment with these bases in the major product categories and services before the end of the year and into the first part of Q1, call it January. And we're going to continue that alignment as we move forward with the remaining bases. So that's what we're really looking for. That's our mission that we've been handed to from General Holt, who Mike reports to, and from Mike. So our mission is to work with what we call our boots on the ground, those partners that I mentioned earlier. Just really start working with our small business partners and align those businesses with the bases. Again, I want to make sure I point out, if we have another base outside of this 30 that we're already starting getting alignment with the majority of the product and service categories, we'll launch that base ahead of time. So this isn't set in stone, but we went through these 30 because we already have some type of activity around these 30, or we've already spoken to them, or we've already visited with the bases. And again, it's either us or some of our partners that are involved with them. So that's why we came up with this list. But this is the first 30 that we're going to be talking about as far as alignment. And then we'll go into the other bases as we continue into Q1. So again, very high level of EPS in our NDVSB program, how we work with our small businesses. Our approach is completely different. Lots of other differentiation points within the eMarketplace itself. We'll talk about that on the 20th. We'll also talk about how EPS and NDVSB and our partners assist our small businesses as far as alignment, as far as technology, as far as building catalogs, as far as making their services available and making them the buyers aware of your services on the eMarketplace and how we do all of that. So this isn't just go to a link and someone will contact you and upload your catalog or upload your service providing capability statement. We work hand in hand with all of our small business partners. And again, I'll be talking about that on the 20th in a lot more detail. But for now, we're very focused on the Air Force First Look program. And it's an honor to turn this over to Mr. Mike Hogan. So Mike, all yours, sir.
Great, thank you very much. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yep, please.
Yes, sir.
Okay, perfect. So that's who I am. Next slide. That's what we're going to talk about. Next slide, and I'll jump straight into this. I'm not good at kind of boring slides. So what this is a very, very messy slide, and I did that intentionally. So these news articles kind of give a small selection of the bombardment that our small businesses are facing right now. Complex regulations, government shutdowns, geopolitical instability, trade wars, e-commerce. We're all painfully familiar with COVID-19 as the country shut down. We have worker shortages in key industries, from truckers to computer chips to raw materials. And all of this kind of suddenly surfaced in supply chains that we thought were robust and commercially controlled. So, one, we recognize the pain that our small businesses are going through. In the FY20 Industrial Capabilities Report to Congress, we highlighted a steady deindustrialization of the U.S. over the past 5 decades. The U.S. GDP has shrunk while shedding more than 6 million manufacturing jobs from 2000 to 2015. And it says in that report, many U.S. small and mid-sized businesses exited the defense field over the last 3 decades, not only because of reduced demand, building fewer platforms and all that kind of stuff than we once did, but also because doing business with the government has proven too difficult with margins too low. So as we think about near-peer competitors such as China continue to aggressively dominate markets through initiatives such as One Belt, One Road, IP theft, government subsidizing of industries, and they're planning on surpassing the U.S. GDP around 2027 8 moved forward significantly due to the uneven impacts from COVID. So we don't have, from a very strategic standpoint, we don't have the benefit to wait and make sense of all this churn that's happening to our small businesses. We understand the value that our small businesses provide, both as a technological advantages. Some of our greatest innovations have come from small business, including the airplane, obviously is near and dear to my heart within the Air Force, but also some of the socio benefits that small businesses provide to that. So we can't afford to just sit back and wait and find out how this story is going to happen, evolve over time. We need to intervene now. Next slide, please. And it's very easy to kind of think about this in a strategic context, but rather than being very impersonal, I want to draw you down to a very small example of also why this is important to us and certainly to me. So this doesn't hit home until it's hit home with anything. And so for me, my first experience was just joining the military. My very first base was KISR Air Force Base. Many of you are going to wonder, what in the heck is that? And that's because it's closed. And so as a freshly minted SAC trained warrior, relocating to the Upper Peninsula, wasn't really even sure where the UP was, but off there I went. And, in my first duty station, still learning my craft, learning, kind of where I fit in the world and within this big Air Force. I had a very tight-knit community that kind of took me in and, really kind of created some lasting memories and impressions on me. I remember the culture, I remember the mission and all those sort of things. I remember my trainer, Helen, who is, kind of taught me my new craft, engaging with the local community. And one thing that I really remember most is when that community wound up on the base realignment and closure list. And in 2 short years, that community that kind of absorbed me and trained me and helped me mature into hopefully a productive adult and effective airman in the Air Force, that community quickly evaporated in 2 short years. So jobs were lost. Helen, my supervisor that I mentioned, she was a lifetime local, and she was displaced along with 5,000 others, and actually more than that, but physical employees. So it was a big emotional deal for that community. I moved on in a much smaller community than I went on to, had to pick up those pieces. And it was there that I realized that the 410th Bombardment Wing mission not only had direct impacts on our national security, but also on our local communities and our small businesses as well. And that really resonated and stayed with me. And you can kind of see in that box on the left kind of how even some 20 years on, there's a big $100 million hole in that local community. The bottom timeline, you can kind of see some of the other significant events that have happened, specifically regarding business and doing business with the government, some good, some bad, and we'll kind of talk about that a little bit more on the next slide, please. So if we think about doing business with the government, now kind of going back to a kind of more broad picture, why are we having some of these challenges with small businesses, specific to how that relates to the government? And so we've kind of bucketized that into 4 kind of distinct areas where we think are preventing our small businesses from engaging with us effectively. Regulatory uncertainty, requirements uncertainty, shifting in our buying habits, patterns, and then also access. So when we go to the first bucket, kind of complex regulations, we think of things like Section 889, which some of you may be familiar with, which kind of has requirements on who we can contract with and some of the risk with some Chinese actors and some of those sort of things. But also new ways in which we pay, paying through DFAS, which is certainly different than how commercial pays. So there are some nuances there, and comparatively complex and slow procurement processes to some of our, commercial brethren out there that buy things as well. And so, all of that raised stakes in how we compete for our requirements. And coupled with the kind of the, as I mentioned in the first slide with that congressional report, the low margins, maybe we're not as attractive, even though we have a lot of dollars as we might think. That can be very intimidating to engage with us. And then there's the uncertainty that we kind of can bring. So, we just ended our end of fiscal year in FY21 in September. So in the acquisition community, we're taking a breath. But, typically because of, how we're funded, sometimes we have continuing resolutions as we do now. Sometimes we get that money, that 1 year money that we have to buy that in. So that really compresses how and when we buy. So if you think of a normal organization and even your own personal budgets, kind of how you typically, spend in your year, certainly you don't take your whole annual paycheck and spend all of that in a couple, months and make sure you spend every last penny of that. Well, that's kind of how we're forced to do things based on appropriations within the government. So that can be very challenging for you as industry to kind of have that very concentrated throughput of requirements. So, if you're a small business, you're probably worrying about, the capacity to respond to all these RFQs and RFPs, about missing opportunities, in different formats and those sort of things, different language, different timelines. And then if you do win, do you have a warehouse space to kind of have all that throughput, a year's worth of goods in a couple months? And can the industry provide all that capacity that, many of you are buying from others? So you've promised to sell that to us and, provide it within a certain timeline. Can you actually meet those? So, all kind of complexities and nuances that we understand that make it, difficult to do business with us. And then after that, we kind of go through a quiet period where we don't buy anything because, again, we're in continuing resolution or something like that. So, you have employees, and how do you go about, rationalizing that short, concentrated period and then that kind of lull in the workforce? So do I need to lay off employees? What about the loans? And, when's the next opportunity coming? Those sort of things. And if you're local to a base and, that is your base, that's oftentimes who your biggest customers are. So I'll get to kind of how we can first look as trying to get after some of these challenges. I know I'm presenting a lot of problems up front, but I promise there's good news at the end. And then our buying patterns, no secret there. We have really gone from, especially when we think of government-wide purchase card spend, so anything under $10,000. Used to be $2,500. Now it's up to $10,000 that we can decentralize that spend, having cardholders just kind of go with a credit card and buy that. $10,000 to me on my personal credit card, that's a lot of money. So, that's the kind of power and how we've decentralized that, which for the Air Force is about $1.7, almost $1.8 billion we spend every year on that. So, we've moved a lot of that from typically where we would go downtown to now we're actually going online to do that. So how do you become discovered, in that big old noisy online sort of thing? And then lastly, we understand the access. We have great relationships with our communities, as I kind of talked about my experience with KI. And that has not changed. But what has changed is the connective business tissue that we have with you. Because of September 11th, we had to close our gates. Certainly, security that we have to do. But that makes it much harder for you as businesses to kind of understand what we buy, what we need, what we value, what we actually do on bases. And, so when you do site visit, it takes a lot more time to get on base. When you make deliveries, a delivery can take a lot more time to, physically deliver something. So, waiting in a search area and all this kind of stuff, that takes time, valuable time for you guys that may or may not have, guys and gals, sorry, but you may not have, that kind of staff to just sit around waiting for, a single transaction to deliver that. So we realize that kind of stuff. So all of that to say, next slide, please. All of that turns into this. So before where, we had those great business connective tissue with our businesses in our local community, we've kind of become a black hole on the map. You know that there's an Air Force base out there, but what happens inside, nobody really knows. And that is the problem that, kind of spawned Air Force First Look. So next slide, please. So all of that to say, there's been good and bad from some of those challenges and changes when I talk about the increasing the, the decentralized spend that we do and all that. So we've awarded more money to smaller businesses. So that's great, but we're doing it to 20% fewer small businesses. So if you're on the plus side of that, that's great because you're probably getting a lot more money from the government and the Air Force. But if you're not, you're kind of left on the side saying, how do I break into that market? And that's been a mixed impact based on, industry, depending on different industries. Some of it is really starting to centralize and others, less so. We've also reduced our duplication. So, if you think of our contracting officers that have to take a lot of classes and understanding on how we contract and, all the rules and policy that we have to follow to do that, they're now focusing their expertise on more complex issues, which is absolutely good. So we're doing less duplicative contracts, and that's also good for industry because you don't have to keep competing for the same work again and again and again, because it costs you time and effort to compete for those as well. So hopefully we can do that in a more deliberative manner and make it, lower that bar to do business with us. And e-commerce is up. Again, Section 846, if you're not familiar with, Congress enacted pilot for GSA to have a multiple e-commerce portal providers, recognizing what the rest of America has done is it's a lot easier to buy through e-commerce than kind of traditional ways, but we don't want to lose that connective tissue that we've always had with you. Next slide, please. So here's where the good news comes from. So again, we in the Air Force recognize all those challenges that I laid out for you, all the difficult ways that it is. And then some of the benefits, e-commerce is a great tool. So we can't just kind of put that genie back in the bottle. So for the Air Force, that's the Air Force First Look. And the trick is kind of in the name. We want to give those local small businesses our first look. And if you can't provide those sort of things, then we'll go on and we'll do businesses we've kind of morphed into. But if we can, we would prefer to do business with you, again, because we understand the value that you as a small business, you as a local, we live in the same communities. So we understand the value that you bring. And so at heart, we didn't have to change any policy or create any real new rules. What we've always lacked is the ability to do something like this easier. And so working with industry partners such as NVDS, we're being able to realize this dream of being able to keep the easy aspect of e-commerce, but then also find our local business, our local small businesses. And one of the things I alluded to in the earlier slides, when you think about your one large customer, say that is the Air Force base near you. What if you had every Air Force base near you? And so as David kind of alluded to, they're the zonable private marketplaces, but they link into an overall Air Force program. So if I'm at, say, FE Warren, but I may have a customer in another base at Shaw or Hill or somewhere else, if they don't have those local kind of suppliers, then I can now easily reach out to those bases with really minimal investment. So, it's enabling us to act as a single kind of buying activity, enhancing competition and raising the profile of our local small businesses. That's going to increase competition, which is good for us. It gives us supplier redundancy, helps us get good pricing, but it also gives you an easy economical way to compete for Air Force dollars across our enterprise without being able to do that. Typically you would have to rely on phone books, if anybody remembers what those are, and those sort of things. Next slide, please. And we're pretty clear on why we're doing this. Obviously, the impact to our local communities. We know that being able to use these e-commerce portals is going to, increase our efficiency, but also increase our spend to our local communities. So being able to do this efficiently for our cardholders, we have, I didn't mention it before, but 26,000 buyers under me that kind of, buy just $1.8 billion across the enterprise. So you now are plugging into that whole buying requirement. Helping that organic outreach and helping you understand how you fit into that. And then we realize there's going to be an economic impact, and we are measuring dollars and jobs as far as how this positively impacts. And I will tell you, from the current administration down through us, we did this before, it was an administration priority, but they absolutely have that same kind of vision that, we want to positively impact our local communities, our small businesses, some of these folks that typically wouldn't get access to these sort of dollars across the federal government. And as David alluded to, others are starting to replicate this. So this is going to be much bigger than just the Air Force, much bigger than any of that. And then what we want to be able to do is we start getting data, being able to understand how this is impacting. And, we start kind of where you're at. So, from a very transactional one and done kind of requirement, hey, I need a widget and you sell me a widget. But as we start doing that more and more often, maybe we can look at that data and start understanding that, I've worked with these, 10 or 15 or however many, businesses, and I've bought a lot of these widgets. What if we started setting up a blanket purchase agreement or a indefinite delivery type contract? So now I can start easing you into more complex vehicles that have greater, and I'll share on the next slide, kind of greater access to higher dollars rather than just that $1.8 billion we're talking about now. What if that was even more? And we were able to advance you on that continuum, kind of in I want to say a safe, but an easy kind of well thought out continuum. So you could compete and, go where you're strongest in meeting our needs. And then understanding, it helps industry understand what the Air Force buys. And I've had so many different questions on, what does the Air Force buy? And if some of you, I apologize, probably know this painfully, but others have no idea. And, an Air Force base is a city. Right? We have hospitals, gyms, we have education facilities, we have vehicle depots, we fly these big noisy things in the air that sound like freedom to us. We do all these sort of, things. We have hospitals on a base. And so anything that any one of those, kind of civic or commercial organizations would need to run their fleets or, perform those duties, the Air Force needs that. Some of that we have through strategic vehicles, and some of it due to the pace and the tactical requirements, we decentralize that spend. So it's the whole spectrum of what we need to kind of fulfill those missions. Next slide, please. And so when we look at kind of where you fit in, again, if we look at this slide, kind of if you look at it on the far left, that kind of shows kind of the complexity of how we're doing that, and then on the bottom, kind of the right value. And so GPC, Government-Wide Purchase Card Program, as I talked about, that's my 26,000 buyers across the enterprise. Every base we have those, and they can go up to $10,000, kind of per requirement. No questions asked. They have requirements what they can and can't do, but by and large they can kind of do that as their mission dictates. But then we get into kind of more complex, so over $10,000 up to $250,000, which is called our simplified acquisition threshold. And so that's where purchase orders and blanket purchase agreements kind of start kicking in. So a little bit more terms and conditions, typically repeat buys, invoicing, those sort of things. We go into contracts and IDIQ contracts, kind of really moving up that continuum. And then enterprise-wide vehicles. So, a contract that that we would lease through one of our contracting officers that goes across the enterprise. So all Air Force or maybe even DoD or federal-wide type contracts, which can, get into billions of dollars. So that's kind of the full spectrum. And so we really want to meet you where you are. And some of you are very happy where you're at, and you don't want to grow your businesses. You just want to have a stable income and all that. And, that is great. And some of you want to grow your contract, grow your businesses. And so you can kind of see how that step ladder approach could work in something like that. Next slide, please. Because I want to leave some time at the end for questions, because I'm very excited by the kind of the diversity of some of you out there. So I'd love to hear kind of your questions and thoughts and kind of what's on your mind. So I appreciate your time, and I want to leave time for that. But I also want to give you some nuggets, that you can look at. And so these, I won't really go in deep into them, but anything under the SAT, the Simplified Acquisition Threshold, is automatically set aside for small businesses. So if you're a small business, then that is legally set aside for you, and we have to say we can't set it aside. If an airplane was that and there's no small businesses that did that, and obviously we would have to waive that. But by and large, by default, those dollars are set aside for small businesses, and that's in law. So if it's not feasible, then FAR Part 19. So the FAR is the Federal Acquisition Regulation, and so that's kind of our rule book, if you will, on how we go about doing business. If you've never heard of it before, go ahead and Google it. Don't start reading it cover to cover. If you do, you'll be my hero, and you may be insane. It's very, very complex. A lot of regulations in there. But that kind of gives you some of the understanding of how and why we do what we do. And then there's multiple different, avenues. I kind of talked about on the complexity, but you can also be subcontractors. There's a lot of IDIQs in place. So GSA, Government Services Administration, they do a lot of, government-wide type contracts. And so typically, you have to have a little bit of business under your belt before you kind of try and tackle one of those. But there's other avenues to be able to do that. And there's a lot of vehicles that have subcontractor requirements. And this is, getting more and more important as, we look at, kind of some of those challenges you guys are having. So even if we don't have a small businesses at the helm of that contract, they have requirements to do subcontracting opportunities with small contracts. So again, to help you kind of go through that, that continuum. Next slide, please. So you don't have to go through any eMarketplace provider. So, some of the sort of things that you have to do is, register. And if you go to sam.gov, go on there, and I encourage you to register. Everything over certain dollar limits, we have to post on there for requirements. So you can kind of see exactly what, to the earlier question of what do we buy. Outside of the GPC program, which none of that will be on there, but everything above that is going to be on sam.gov. So you can understand what your size standard is based on your NAICS code, the North American Industry Classification System. So if you sell certain types of products, and you can be a large business in one area and a small business in another area. So if you sell under multiple NAICS codes, that kind of helps you understand what size standard you are, whether it's an employee or overall sales. DUNS numbers, some of those sort of things you're going to have to, get used to. If you don't already have those, I encourage you to start kind of doing some of that research. I won't go into that now, but just so you can start understanding some of that terminology. And then next slide, please. So I won't, again, I'll leave this kind of for after reading material, but just know that there's, Air Force small business. So we have a small business administration, obviously at the federal level, and the Air Force has our SAF-SB, so under the Secretary of the Air Force, small business. That is what they do. They are your champion as a small business. So that link will give you help. There's also PTAX, many of you may be familiar with, and other partnerships. So next slide, and then I'll kind of hand it back over to David, and then we can have some sort of questions. So these are some other resources, and I definitely encourage you to kind of look at those on how to help grow your business. And I know a lot of you excited to hear are part of other organizations that are providing those sort of help, such as the Rosie Network and others. I won't be able to mention them all, but those are great organizations. Again, dedicated to whatever sort of socioeconomic status you are, or if you're a veteran, or if you're a small-owned business, woman-owned small business, those sort of things. A lot of resources to you as small businesses. So as I kind of alluded to at the very beginning, there's a lot of challenges. I mean, it's hard being a small business, anyway. And if you take out all the things that are going on now, that makes it even more challenging. So if you take nothing else away from this, I want you to know that the Air Force is interested and prioritizes small businesses and those other socioeconomic factors that we talked about. We want to do business with you. We understand the value that you do that. So don't be afraid to reach out to your local small business, or excuse me, your local Air Force base and say, I'm a small business. How do I go about doing that? At every small business, there is someone else that is focused on small businesses within the Air Force chain that wants to help you. So without any further else, David, I'll hand it back to you, and happy to answer any questions.
Okay, Mike, thank you very much. Julie, if you can, we'll take the questions now, and if you have those, we can start calling those out. We've answered some, I think, that have come through on the chat. So can you go ahead and start with the questions and call them out for us?
Sure. So it looks like there's quite a few from Mike. And I know that some of these you may have touched on a little bit, but we have somebody that is looking, they offer cloud-based solutions like Azure and AWS. Is this something that's included in this budget spend? So cloud-based, building cloud-based solutions, yeah.
Yeah, so when I talk about the $1.8 billion that we spend, that probably is not part of that. That's probably a lot of that. So our software spend, a lot of that we have in, some strategic vehicles, enterprise license agreements, some of those sort of things. And so, some of those sort of things we have strategic vehicles for. And sometimes we're going to have tactical needs either for training or maybe, kind of one-off licenses where we do that. So short answer is there's probably some, but a lot of that is going to be covered by some of our enterprise-wide vehicles.
Great, thanks. So I can tell that this next question coming from Myron, they must do business with the Air Force already or federal government, because there's terminology in here I don't know, so you might know it. Can a DPAS or ACAT rating be assigned after a PO has been issued to help with delivery requirements due to supply chain issues?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And so just for the larger, the Defense Production Act, so if you're DO or DX rated, that kind of is the priority in, your requirements. So getting access to other material and that kind of stuff and moving it through. So I would definitely recommend you talk to your contracting officer who let the contract for very specific guidance on that. Typically those are done up front. They're DX coded, which kind of gives you national priority for some of those sort of things. But I definitely encourage you to talk to your CO specifically if you're having supply chain impacts, even if it can't be, met. If it's outside of your control, I would communicate early and often with your CO to help them, understand what you're going through so they can act accordingly and assist you with that.
Great, thanks. Now, Priscilla is asking, are there CMMC requirements for?
Yes. So, yeah, no, that's a great question. And so that's the cyber maturity model. I always get the acronym wrong. I know that's what it is. So relating to cybersecurity. And so for most of our micro purchase spend, so when we think about the $10,000 and under, that won't apply. That will be, that's going to be at higher dollar level than our kind of, think of e-commerce and kind of micro purchase spend. However, there are other sort of things, as I kind of alluded to, with Section 889 that has to do with, think Huawei, ZTE, Hytera, those kind of things. And there's two aspects to that, and that is new, where it typically, those kind of rules don't apply under the micro purchase threshold. Section 889 does. And so I'm absolutely happy to kind of provide some additional information on that, that I'll say NDVSB can kind of push out to you in association with that. But that has to do with representing that, one, you won't provide the government, and that's by law, some of those sort of things. So think ZTE, Hytera, Huawei type products. And then you have to represent within your processes if you have any key components that control those sort of things. So again, think national security risk and how that may transition to the Air Force. But for CMMC, that wouldn't apply under the micro.
Right. And Mike, if I can add to that, this is David. Our team here at NDVSB and EPS, we also help all of our small business partners with the 889 requirement. So making sure that you are compliant with 889 product offerings that are associated, that have catalogs, your catalog is compliant, and making sure that you have your certificate. The 889 certificate is actually on the eMarketplace, where the buyer can find it before they purchase from you if they want to be able to see your 889. So we assist all the small businesses. For those of you that aren't familiar with the 889, it can get complicated, but you're always assigned to somebody here at my company to assist you in all those areas. Julie?
Thanks. Yep, thanks, David. So here's a question. I don't believe that any Air Force bases are still open anywhere near our small business. You mentioned local small businesses near the bases would be who they would want to do business with. So assuming we would not get the opportunity, as they would not be local, they're close to a Coast Guard base. So that just talking about that, the overall opportunity, if they're not near a base.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so I won't backtrack, but I will tell you that, First Look is absolutely laser focused on our local small businesses. But that's not to say that, because you're not near an Air Force base or near a military base, that we don't care. As I kind of alluded to, the Air Force and certainly, the federal government prioritizes small business. So just because you're not near an Air Force base does not mean you don't provide those benefits that I kind of mentioned, and you don't face those challenges. So, it doesn't, take away from the fact that we still want to do business with you. The challenge is when you think about the volume of small businesses that we have, it becomes very, very difficult to kind of find you through all that and be able to have it be manageable. So what I would recommend doing is, if there are, depending upon what you buy, I would go on sam.gov, that was kind of in that other slide, and look at, and I'm making this up, but just say you sell computers or software or something like that. Find out what those product service codes, so PSC codes are, and if you go to pscfsc.com, that's a machine learning thing, and you can type in natural language like computer, and it'll tell you what PSC that is associated with that. And then go on sam.gov and look and see, who are the buyers for that. Absolutely, the Air Force will, but you'll also find the Army, the Navy, GSA. You're going to find all sorts of people that buy that. And then I would reach out to those folks. They should have a small business specialist and say, I want to do business with the Air Force, the Army, Department of Homeland Security, Veterans Administration, whoever that is. Find out who those buyers are and find out how you do business with them. sam.gov is that one clearinghouse where we post all of our requirements for above the micro purchase threshold. So I'm happy to talk more if that wasn't clear, but absolutely, we value all small businesses.
And I can add to that as well, if you don't mind, Mike. For whoever that question came from, please join the webinar on the 20th. As I mentioned, the NDVSB program is continuing to scale. So the Army will We've had discussions with the Army at Pentagon Purchasing, and we're going to follow a similar path that Mike's talking about today with their GPC card holders. We've also presented to OSDBU, the other federal agencies for small businesses. So everything Mike is referencing, we're going to continue to scale this out through the DoD and through other federal agencies. So once you're part of the NDVSB eMarketplace, you'll also be part of those opportunities that are coming in the future. So love to have you on the 20th. I'll be getting into more detail about that then. Julie?
Thank you. So here's a good question, Mike. How many bases are there in the U.S. that we can work with? So what is the total number of bases or installations under
that is a good question. I should know that off the top of my head. Roughly speaking, and again, don't quote me exactly for this, but there's roughly 78 main operating bases. So, and obviously, sometimes there's annexes and, those sort of things. So, but roughly there's 78 main operating bases. A few of those may be overseas, but the majority obviously are stateside.
Great, thanks. Here's one from Jasmine. Our firm has had a challenging time tracking down procurement forecasts for the Air Force. Where can we access or find these forecasts?
That is a great question. And so what I would recommend is, again, I would talk to your, if you have a local or, even if they're not local, contact your local small business professional. So there are some tools out there for very large requirements where we do forecasting on that. I don't have that off the top of my head, but I'll see if I can get that, and I'll shoot that over to NDVSB so they can include that as kind of part of the overall offering. But I will also tell you, for a lot of our micro purchase spend, we don't do a great job at forecasting. As a lot of the I'll say the operational spend. So you can retrospectively kind of look at it through either sam.gov, or you can also go on, if you type in D2D, data to decisions, GSA, that will kind of give you a good overview of what we've bought in the past, or Gov't.spend is another one. And you can kind of understand from a category, from a taxonomy, like, IT, professional services, facilities and construction, that kind of stuff, what we've bought in the past. And, barring huge mission changes, we're pretty much creatures of habit. So, that wouldn't be, auditable, correct, but you can kind of get directionally correct kind of information on what we typically buy. And if we buy that in the past, we typically buy that in the future.
Great. Now, we've had a lot of questions about services and the types of services that the Air Force would use. And I think that you've answered that by, directing people to go to look at GSA to see the types of services. Would you like to add more? We've had people everywhere from architectural services to IT staffing, facilities, maintenance, all different kinds of.
Absolutely. And so for a question like for services, I would probably recommend you talking to a local base because they're going to have a much more granular understanding and idea. And those small business specialists work specifically with contracting officers. And so when I'm a contracting officer, I'm like, hey, I'm looking for janitorial service, or I'm looking for grounds maintenance, or I'm looking for elevator maintenance, or, lab testing, testing services, refereeing, because we have non-appropriated funds too, which I haven't really talked about, but we also do some of that. So, when you think about non-congressionally, dollars that, that we generate through, AAFES is a great example. They donate to the Air Force that we use non-appropriated funds for. So we can even do, refereeing and stuff like that. But if you talk to those small business specialists, they are in direct communication with those contracting officers, and they can provide those links. So if they know what you're doing, and you have a contracting officer that says, gosh, I'm just having a hard time, or, I want to see who's out there. They are great conduits to kind of draw some of those links. But as I kind of alluded to, we do everything from staff augmentation, where, we have people that, and if you're, a prior vet, understand what the military does, we augment through contractors a lot of that workforce, in addition to our civilian brethren and sisters. And then we also do everything, again, that a normal kind of city would do. So hospital services, transportation services, you know, a lot of professional and technical expertise that we contract for. So just an absolute massive amount. A lot of our base operating support. So think of any kind of facility support. We contract out for a lot of that. And so whether, you know, sometimes we have base-wide contracts where we do that. And that would allow you to potentially be a subcontractor sometimes, or maybe even a prime contractor where you own that that contract. Both of those are great things. So going to your small business specialists are a great kind of first step to plugging into that.
And if I could add to that as well, if you don't mind, Mike. Mike mentioned a small business specialist. It's one of the slides that we use in our other presentations. So we also work with other key stakeholders on the bases, like the small business specialist. So for services, one of the nice things about the NDVSB AAFES eMarketplace is that we do have services on there, and we've built a keyword search. Instead of NAICS codes, we work with our small businesses to use keywords, making it that much easier for buyers to find you. They also, as we continue to work with the bases, we're making like the small business specialists aware of the service suppliers that are available on NDVSB Marketplace, so that they can easily find you. So their sourcing part of that, as Mike mentioned, now they're able to find you. They know that you're a small business. They know that you may be local or within the state, and it's easier for them to find you, connect with you, and for you to connect with them. So it's really that first step of visibility. As Mike mentions, a lot of different ways also to approach, to find those folks on the base and different sites you can go to. But we're approaching it with the eMarketplace to where we're saying this is a way you can also look at a way to source. So for you to find these businesses, easily find them, and finding them via keyword search versus using any types of NAICS codes.
And that's, and I apologize, David. Let me just tack onto mine. You know, contracting officers, just like we do in our personal lives, we use eMarketplace to conduct market research to find out, you know, what's out there. So yeah, that's a great point. We very often will use platforms like this to conduct market research, just as kind of our initial planning too. So yeah, great point.
Thank you.
Here's a question in terms of the first look and being considered first look or local. Is there a geographical threshold or mileage radius that you're using to consider? What do you consider local?
That's a great question. So just being completely transparent, we've initially set kind of a 50-mile radius around our local bases. But I will tell you this, that was kind of, we expect to kind of refine this over time. And I'll give you kind of two examples if you're familiar with Air Force bases or any military base. You know, when I was at KI Sawyer, or if I'm at FE Warren, you know, some of these other sort of bases, they're more remote because we fly loud things, we have dangerous things, and, you know, we want clear airspace. We go out in the middle of nowhere, which means, you know, our local community maybe a little bit further than typical. We also have some bases where, you know, the community has grown around us. Tampa, Florida has McGill Air Force Base. You know, there's, you know, many examples of that too. So, you know, I will say that we intend on looking at that kind of geographical boundary and having that match kind of data. I apologize, that's my dog. But I'm big about, you know, letting data drive those kind of decisions. So we have an initial stab at that, but, you know, we want to be directionally correct, not, you know, accurate. So we expect that to kind of shift over time.
Great, thanks, Mike. And I know we need to wrap up here. We just have another minute left, and we have a ton of other questions, so we might have to do a Q&A document to help answer some of these. But David, there's one very good question for you, is how do we sign up?
Great question. I love that question. Yeah, so the last slide here that you'll see is contacting our sales group or our software consultants here, and that's the email address below, sales@eprosvcs.com, abbreviate services, so sales@eproservices.com. And I just had a question that I was typing out. Is there a cost to participate in the program? Well, with all eMarketplaces, there's always a technology requirement. So if you have the technology, then there is no cost other than a transaction fee. So my group will talk to you about the technology requirements. If you don't have the technology requirements, summary, because it's already 4 o'clock, which means you have to be able to build an e-catalog, you have to be able to receive that order automatically into your system, and then you're going to have to be able to process that Gov't Pcard and provide the base level 3 line item banking detail. So if you say yes to all those, and you don't, then you have the technology. If you say no, NDVSB put together a $2 million fund for our small businesses. So we have a discount for all 3 modules to be able to help afford that technology, especially in these financial times that we have. So it's only $1,500 annual. It's about $100,000 as far as market value, and it's typically $5,000 annual. So we use that fund to help our small businesses get going. And then I talk about the transaction fee. Other federal e-marketplaces are somewhere between 9 and 15% on a transaction fee to participate in their e-marketplaces. So we worked with the DoD and the other agencies, and we're only going to be charging a 5% transaction fee. So very competitive when you're comparing against the other federal e-marketplaces. Pricing within the e-marketplaces not compared to GSA schedule, they're compared to other federal e-marketplaces as well. So go back to what Mike said about being more competitive. Coming out of the gates, our small business partners, and compared to some of the other e-marketplaces, are going to be very, very competitive because that transaction fee is so much lower. So I just want, now I'll stop typing to answer that question.
Thanks. And one question just came in that's really important, and I want to answer it before we hang up. Is this only for veteran-owned companies?
No, it's a great question. So that's acronym you have there, and yes, another wonderful acronym: National Diversity. It just put an "and" in there then. National Diversity Veteran and Small Business. So it's for diversity businesses, small businesses, and veterans, service disabled, mill spouse. So small businesses, and no, it's not just for veterans.
Great. So I think we're beyond our time here. We have, again, lots of questions. We will get answers to those questions to the users that have joined us today. Please watch for an email that will come out, which will have a link to the recording. And we thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you, Mike, for speaking. Thank you, your dog, as well, for joining us. And David,
yes,
back to you.
Thank you. Yep, thank you very much. Again, I appreciate everybody's time. We're really excited about what's going on. We're going to have continue to have webinars like this. As I said, we're talking to the Army as well as other federal agencies, working very closely with Mike, so we know an hour there's a lot we have to cover in an hour. So we're going to have another webinar as we continue to move forward to give updates. That'll be pre or post Thanksgiving. So we'll continue to do that. And again, you all will see another invite for a webinar on the 20th to talk about not only this opportunity and where it's headed, but all the other opportunities under NDVSB program. So thank you again, and everybody have a great weekend.